And of course, that leads me to determining costs. So again, as we're doing all these things, we're really starting to think about the dollar value. And that's got to feed into our budget. And sometimes our budgets will have both a revenue and an expenditure element to it. Most common in the context that we're talking about, there'll be just an expenditure component to it. So what are the costs that are going to be incurred, and when will they be incurred? Thinking about that. And costs can be things such as general expenses like labor and on costs. So it's not just about how much per hour, but it's also things like superannuation, payroll tax where relevant, and so forth. Can be determining costs such as consultancy costs that I talked about, or equipment hire or purchase that I talked about, materials and supplies. It can also include things such as if we're going to be getting specialists in. Part of the contractual arrangements might also be things such as allowances for meal allowances, or payment of accommodation or transportation, be that transportation of materials and equipment, or transportation of people. It can also be other general expenses that are accumulated as part of the project, such as telecommunications, like telephone, mobile phone costs and charges, and or utility power and so forth. If you're working in the private sector and you're managing a project, you would be accountable for all these costs. Within the public service, what you might find is that as part of your project rationale, even though those costs may not be incurred by your team or your cost center per se, you may still need to identify those so that you can still put a final financial figure to the cost and return for your project. In some cases, though, you'll be required to transfer, even though you won't necessarily. Some of those costs are already, some of those resources are already absorbed by the business. Say, for example, utility costs. You may need to have a transference of those costs from the general cost center to your project's cost center, depending on what your project is and what level of analysis and detail they want to get it from the financials. But we want to try and forecast. Our endeavor is to forecast as much of these expenses as possible and pick them up and put them in the budget so that we have no surprises in the project. Anything that we miss here, it's going to still be incurred through the project, and it's going to blow out our budget. So we don't want that to happen. So we make sure that, use an old building analogy, we measure twice and cut once in terms of identifying the costs, so that we're minimizing any surprises during the project. The type of budgets that you'll get as a project manager will vary depending on the context of your work, on the nature of the project, and the level of accountability, of course. But a typical budget might be something like this, and I've just pulled out a couple of examples where you might have an annual budget over 12 months. You might have a quarterly budget, and then you have an actual. So your actual will be against your budget. You'll have a variance in terms of dollars, and then you'll have a variance in terms of percentage. So you generally have your revenue or your income stream up here, then you have your expenditures down here in this component, and depending on the business, on whether it's fixed or flexible. So in some cases the dollars are fixed in terms of budgets, in other cases they're flexible and you'll work to percentages. So your total, so it's not unusual, for example, for expense budgets to be based on flexible, based on percentages. So that way, if your revenue increases, of course, it's going to cost you more to be able to service that. So you, as an organization, will say, look, we accept overexpenditure in these expenses, in maybe all or some, but you still got to keep your percentage in line. So some budgets are fixed, some budgets are flexible, or you'll find usually a combination of both, and different lines of fixed or flexible. But sometimes you might get a project cost such as on the right-hand side here, which is more the kind of project costs that you'd see from something like Microsoft Project, where you'll have those tasks that'll be extrapolated from the inputs that you put into the project. You'll have a breakdown in terms of labor hours, labor costs, material costs, travel costs, and then a budget per task, which then you run your budget against that. So different variations depending on the context and the organization.